Most men don't realize the relationship is over when it ends. They realize it months earlier, in tiny moments they tried very hard to ignore. Not during the fights, not when she says, "I need space." Not even when she stops saying, "I love you" first. It happens in quieter places, like when you tell her something that mattered to you, and you watch her eyes drift for half a second. Just half a second. But something in your chest notices it immediately. Or when you're sitting beside her in silence, and instead of feeling calm, you feel alone. That feeling? Most men talk themselves out of it, because accepting the truth would mean admitting something painful. You can be deeply attached to someone who has already emotionally started leaving. And before we go deeper into this, if you're the kind of man who quietly carries things and rarely hears anyone say them out loud, subscribe. Not because you need another channel in your feed, but because some conversations are easier to face when you realize you're not the only one living them. Now, I need you to understand something women rarely say directly. A woman usually doesn't stop loving you all at once. She stops in layers, slowly, psychologically, internally. And by the time a man notices the obvious signs, she's often been grieving the relationship alone for months. That's why this hurts so much for men. Because male love is often reactive. Female love is often accumulative. A man sees what's happening now. A woman feels the emotional pattern of what's been happening for a long time. And sometimes, you're trying to save a relationship she emotionally buried 3 arguments ago. I've sat across from women who said things like, "I still care about him, I just don't feel safe opening my heart anymore." That sentence destroys men because they hear, "She still cares." But they miss the second half entirely. Women can care about you deeply and still no longer feel emotionally connected to you. That contradiction confuses men constantly, because men often associate love with presence. If she's still here, still texting, still sleeping beside you, it must mean something is alive. Sometimes it does. Sometimes she's already halfway gone and trying to convince herself to stay. And you know the terrifying part? A woman who no longer loves you doesn't always become cold immediately. Sometimes she becomes strangely polite. That's the part nobody warns men about. The absence of emotion is obvious, but the absence of emotional urgency? That's subtler. She stops fighting for understanding, stops trying to explain herself fully, stops pushing to fix things. At first, it even feels peaceful. The arguments decrease, the tension softens. She says, "It's fine," more often. And you think, maybe we're finally getting better. No. Sometimes that calm is emotional resignation. Because people only argue intensely when they still believe being understood matters. A woman who still loves you will usually react emotionally. A woman who has emotionally detached often reacts administratively. That shift is devastating when you finally notice it. Conversations start sounding formal. Care becomes routine instead of alive. Affection feels timed instead of spontaneous. And the hardest part? You can feel her body beside you, while emotionally she feels miles away. Men describe this experience in almost identical ways without realizing it. They say, "I don't know, it just felt different." Yes, because your nervous system was detecting emotional withdrawal before your mind was ready to admit it. And deep down, you already knew. One of the clearest signs she doesn't love you anymore is this. She stops being emotionally curious about you. And that sounds small until you experience it. Because when a woman truly loves a man, she studies him without realizing she's doing it. She notices tiny shifts in his mood, the way his voice changes after a stressful day, the difference between his "I'm tired" and his "something's wrong." She asks questions that aren't really questions. How was your meeting? Did you eat? What happened with your brother? Not because she's interviewing you, because emotionally invested people naturally move toward each other's inner world. But when love fades, curiosity fades first. And most men miss this because they're trained to focus on dramatic signs: cheating, lying, distance, disrespect. But emotional disconnection usually begins in much quieter ways. She stops asking follow-up questions. You mention something important, and instead of leaning in, she just says, "Oh, nice. That's good." no depth, no emotional reach. And maybe part of you notices it instantly, but another part says, she's probably just tired. That's what men do when they're afraid of the answer. They reinterpret emotional absence as temporary stress. Now listen carefully because this part matters. A woman doesn't have to hate you to stop loving you. In fact, some women become kinder after emotionally detaching. Not warmer, kinder. There's a difference. Warmth has emotional presence inside it. Kindness can exist without intimacy. That's why some men become confused when she's still respectful, still supportive, still technically good to them. They think, if she stopped loving me, wouldn't she act terrible? No. Sometimes the guilt of emotionally leaving makes her softer, especially if you're a good man, especially if she knows you love her deeply. So she starts managing your feelings instead of sharing herself honestly. And this creates one of the most psychologically painful dynamics a man can experience. You begin surviving on fragments. A good morning text, a quick kiss, a decent conversation once every few days. And because you're emotionally starving, those small moments feel enormous. You cling to them. You replay them in your head like proof the relationship is still alive. Meanwhile, your body is constantly anxious because inconsistency creates obsession. That's not weakness, that's psychology. Human beings bond harder to unpredictable emotional reward than stable emotional safety. So the less emotionally available she becomes, the more desperately your mind searches for signs that she still cares. You start overanalyzing everything, the speed of her replies, the tone in her voice, how long she hugged you, whether she looked at you differently before bed. And slowly, without realizing it, you stop feeling like her partner and start feeling like someone trying to win her back. That shift changes a man. You become hyper-aware, careful, emotionally exhausted. You rehearse conversations in your head before saying them. You avoid bringing up problems because you're afraid of pushing her further away. You start accepting emotional crumbs just to avoid losing access to her completely. And the tragic part is, the more one person chases emotional connection, the more pressure the detached person feels. So she pulls back further. Not always out of cruelty. Sometimes because she feels overwhelmed by the responsibility of being your emotional oxygen. That's why relationships become so psychologically confusing near the end. Nobody's fully honest about what's happening. One person is quietly grieving, the other is quietly panicking, and both are sleeping inches away from each other, feeling completely alone. There's another sign men almost never talk about honestly because it wounds the ego too deeply. She stops wanting to be seen by you. Not physically at first, emotionally. And if you've experienced this, you know exactly what I mean. At the beginning, a woman in love wants to bring you into her world. She tells you random stories, sends you things that reminded her of you, talks about thoughts she didn't even fully understand yet. You become the person she mentally reaches for. But when emotional love starts fading, something subtle happens. She begins processing her life without you. That's a massive psychological shift. You stop hearing things first. Then eventually, you stop hearing things at all. You find out about her stress late, her plans late, her emotions late. Sometimes from social media, sometimes from other people, sometimes accidentally. And every time it happens, there's this strange ache in you that's hard to explain. Not anger exactly, more like grief mixed with confusion. Because the woman who once narrated her inner world to you now speaks around you instead of to you. And men usually respond to this in one of two ways. Some become louder emotionally, more texts, more effort, more reassurance, more attempts to reconnect. Others become quieter. They sense rejection and retreat inward. They act cool, pretend not to care, tell themselves they're giving her space. But internally, both men are hurting the same way. Because emotional exclusion hits something primal in people, especially men who rarely open up in the first place. When a man finally bonds deeply with a woman, she often becomes his emotional home without him even realizing it. So when that emotional home starts disappearing, he feels psychologically homeless. And here's where things become dangerous emotionally. Men often try to solve emotional disconnection logically. They think, if I improve myself enough, she'll love me again. So they become more productive, more attentive, more disciplined, more successful. None of those things are bad, but sometimes the motivation underneath them is heartbreaking. They're trying to earn back warmth that used to come naturally. You can feel this in relationships immediately. The energy becomes performative. A man starts monitoring himself constantly. Am I saying the wrong thing? Am I not masculine enough? Am I too emotional, too distant, too available? And eventually he stops feeling relaxed around the woman he loves. That's one of the clearest signs emotional safety has disappeared. Love cannot survive long-term where self-monitoring replaces emotional freedom. Now, I need to say something difficult. Sometimes she still loves parts of you. Your history, your loyalty, your heart, the life you built together. But she no longer feels emotionally alive inside the relationship itself. And people stay in relationships like that far longer than outsiders realize. Why? Because leaving someone who loves you is emotionally complicated, especially for women. Many women are deeply aware of emotional consequences. They think about how much pain their honesty could cause. So instead of saying, I don't love you anymore, they say softer things. I've just been stressed. I don't know what's wrong with me. I need time to think. I feel emotionally confused. And sometimes those statements are true, but sometimes they're partial truths covering a deeper reality they're terrified to say out loud. Because once certain words are spoken, the relationship changes forever. So both people participate in a quiet form of denial. She avoids fully admitting her detachment. He avoids fully acknowledging what he already feels. And the relationship slowly fills with silence neither person knows how to survive. You want to know one of the saddest moments in a relationship? It's not the breakup. It's the moment a man realizes he has been trying to reconnect with a version of her that no longer exists. That realization changes the atmosphere inside a person. Because until then, he still believes, if I say it better, if I become calmer, if I fix myself enough, maybe we can go back. Back. That word keeps people trapped for years. But relationships don't really move backward. People change too much inside them, and women especially change emotionally when they feel unseen for long periods of time. Now, that does not mean every woman who loses feelings is innocent or emotionally mature. Some withdraw instead of communicating honestly. Some avoid difficult conversations until resentment hardens inside them. Human beings are complicated, but psychologically, women often disconnect long before they physically leave. Men usually leave when they've decided. Women often leave in stages while still physically present. That's why men feel blindsided. The breakup conversation feels sudden to him, but emotionally old to her. And this creates a brutal imbalance. He begins fighting for the relationship at the exact moment she has become emotionally exhausted from fighting internally for months. So his urgency arrives late. Not because he didn't care, because he didn't fully see the emotional erosion while it was happening. And honestly, many men were never taught how to read emotional distance properly. They were taught to notice disrespect, not withdrawal. They know when someone attacks them. They struggle when someone quietly disappears emotionally while still smiling at dinner. That kind of pain is harder to defend against, because there's no single event to point to, just an accumulation of moments where something felt off. The delayed replies, the distracted affection, the conversations that never quite deepen anymore, the strange emotional politeness. And eventually, a man starts feeling like he's interrupting her peace just by needing closeness. That feeling can damage a person deeply, especially if he already carries old wounds around rejection or abandonment. He starts shrinking emotionally, holding back affection, holding back questions, holding back vulnerability. Not because he doesn't love her, because unanswered love eventually becomes humiliating. That's the part people rarely say out loud. There's a certain humiliation in loving someone more openly than they love you. Not toxic humiliation, human humiliation. The ache of realizing your emotional intensity is no longer being met equally. And men suffer quietly here, very quietly. A lot of men don't cry immediately after heartbreak. They become numb first, functional, distracted, detached. Then months later, some tiny thing breaks them unexpectedly. A song, a scent, an empty side of the bed, a memory of who they were before they started begging internally for reassurance. Because that's what emotional imbalance does. It slowly disconnects you from yourself. You stop asking, "What do I feel?" and start asking, "What do I need to do to keep her from leaving?" That mindset is exhausting. And women feel it too, by the way. When love becomes fueled by fear instead of connection, interactions lose their natural rhythm. Everything feels heavy, forced, like both people are acting inside a relationship instead of living inside one. And eventually, even beautiful memories begin feeling painful, because they remind you how different things used to feel. Here's the truth most men avoid because it cuts deeper than rejection itself. Sometimes the real pain is not losing her. It's realizing how long you abandoned your own intuition trying to keep the relationship alive. You knew things felt wrong. Your body knew. Your silence knew. Even the way you stared at your phone knew. But you kept negotiating with reality because love makes people hopeful long after the evidence changes. And hope can be beautiful until it becomes self-erasure. I've watched men slowly disconnect from their confidence trying to hold on to emotionally unavailable relationships. Not because they were weak, because they loved sincerely. There's a difference. A man in love will tolerate emotional confusion far longer than he admits publicly, especially if he remembers how deeply connected things once felt. That memory becomes dangerous, because he starts comparing her current distance to her former warmth and thinking, "She's still in there somewhere." Maybe. But you cannot build a healthy relationship only from emotional memories. You need present connection, present effort, present emotional openness. And this is where many men finally confront something uncomfortable. Love is not proven by how much pain you can endure. That belief destroys people quietly. Some men think staying loyal while emotionally starving makes their love more meaningful. It doesn't. It just makes the loneliness last longer. Real love does not require you to constantly decode someone's feelings to feel secure beside them. Yes, relationships go through hard seasons. Yes, attraction fluctuates. Yes, people become stressed, depressed, overwhelmed. But sustained emotional detachment changes a person standing inside it. You begin doubting your worth in subtle ways. You overthink harmless interactions. You become anxious over emotional inconsistency. You feel relieved by basic affection that once felt normal. That's when love slowly turns into survival. And survival is not intimacy. Now listen carefully to this part because it matters more than anything else I've said. A woman losing feelings is painful, but losing yourself while trying to stop her from losing feelings, that damage lasts much longer. Because eventually the relationship ends, emotionally or physically, and you're left alone with the version of yourself that spent months abandoning his own emotional reality. That's why healing after these relationships is so complicated. Men don't just grieve the woman, they grieve the effort, the hope, the emotional energy, the imagined future. The version of themselves who believed love would be enough to keep two people emotionally connected. And slowly, if they heal correctly, something important changes. They stop obsessing over whether she truly loved them and start asking a more important question. Why did I need to ignore my own pain just to feel chosen? That question changes lives. Because mature love is not about convincing someone to stay emotionally connected to you. It's about recognizing when connection is being given freely and when you are surviving on emotional leftovers because you're afraid to let go. And maybe that's the hardest truth of all. Some relationships don't end when love disappears. They end when one person finally becomes honest enough to admit it already did. And if this hits something deep in you tonight, don't run from that feeling immediately. Sometimes discomfort is the first moment of real clarity.